Hello, everyone. This video will go over part one of chapter 9 on magazines in the age of specialization. Now, you may not read magazines, but magazines were really the forefront of creating very specialized content, which we really have a lot of in today's digital era, where we're targeting audiences more specifically and getting down to what people are really interested in. So, the history of magazines, as well as its current business, are really interesting to look at because they provided some inspiration for the kinds of specialized content that we are delivered today. So, magazines have changed a lot from their first use. And one of the ways that you can see how widely things have changed is by looking at a single magazine that has been around since 1886, and that's Cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan was started in the 1800s. It was a monthly magazine for the modern family. So it showcased things like cooking, childcare, household decor, all modern things. In 1889, John Walker actually purchased the Cosmopolitan magazine and turned it into a literary magazine, which was popular at the time. Cosmopolitan would feature famous writers and serialize entire books. So instead of getting one publication of the entire book, you'd get like a chapter at a time. This is actually how H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds was published. 1905, Cosmopolitan was sold to Hearst, and it became a muckraking magazine focused on investigative journalism, political issues, and social issues, and really trying to point those out to the public. Now, in 1912, it moved to a monthly illustrated magazine for women, and it included short stories. But it wasn't until 1965 that Cosmopolitan started looking like we know it now. Helen Gurley Brown purchased it, or became the editor, rather, and turned it into the Cosmo Girl, who was fun, fearless female. And it really changed into a women's focused magazine at that time. Now, today, Cosmopolitan is the top women's fashion magazine. It's published in over 80 countries. So we can see that from its original publication in 1886, Cosmopolitan has really gone through a lot of different evolutions that mirror the history of the industry overall. Now, magazines first began in France, and in fact, they were called magazines, which is French for storehouse. If you speak French, please don't judge me. I'm sure I just butchered that. They were actually catalogs that were inserted into newspapers and primarily focused on things that you could purchase. Now, in London in 1704, Daniel Defoe became the editor of the first political magazine, which was Review. And it was a channel for political commentary and argument. The Review magazine actually looked like a newspaper, but it was printed less often. And instead of focusing on current events, it instead used analysis and commentary of larger social issues. Now, Toddler and Spectator appeared around the same time as Review. They used poetry, politics, and philosophy in their publications, and it was targeted towards London's elite, the upper class. And it was regularly published, but only had a circulation of a few thousand people. The first magazine to actually use the word magazine instead of its French counterpart was Gentleman's Magazine in London in 1731. Gentleman's Magazine actually reprinted stories from newspapers, books, and political pamphlets. And it wasn't until later that they actually included original writing by prominent writers of the time, making it more of a literary magazine. Now, magazines in colonial America typically served politicians, educated, and merchant classes. For 50 years, it was 50 years after the first colonial newspaper that the first colonial magazine was published. The first one was in 1741, American Magazine. Its editor was Andrew Bradford, and it only lasted 3 issues. 3 days after the publication of American Magazine, Ben Franklin actually published General Magazine. His didn't last much longer, only 6 months, but Ben Franklin lost out to that being the first in history for the American Magazine just by 3 days. That would just kill you. Now, Independent Reflector and Pennsylvania Magazine were edited by Thomas Paine, and they were really key tools in the American Revolution to rally colonists against British rule. In 1776, 100 magazines had already been created and had already collapsed because they just weren't very popular, and they were very difficult to produce in America for various reasons. Now, a lot of our founding fathers often wrote for magazines, and even Paul Revere worked as a magazine illustrator. So while they were an important part of culture, they weren't successful business-wise. It wasn't until specialty magazines that magazines really saw their success in America. Specialization is the trend of reaching readers who share a particular trait, such as a profession, a set of beliefs, or cultural taste, even demographic values such as race, age, or gender. Now, one of the first specialty magazines in America was Christian Journal and Advocate in 1826. It had a circulation of 25,000, which was very large at the time. It was an overtly religious magazine, a Christian magazine, and boasted very large circulations because of the network of churches that were distributing them. Literary magazines were also very popular in early America. North American Review included writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Mark Twain. You may have heard of them. And then there were specialty magazines that targeted specific professions, and those tended to be more popular than general population magazines as well. Now, Saturday Evening Post was the first general interest magazine that was aimed at a national audience. It was created in 1821 in Philadelphia by Charles Alexander and Samuel Coe Atkinson. It was the longest running magazine in US history, and it included essays and quote unquote borrowed content from famous writers of the time. It incorporated a lot of news, but also literary styles of poetry, essays, and play reviews. Some of the famous authors that were published in Saturday Evening Post were Nathaniel Hawthorne and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it was one of the first major magazines to directly appeal to women with its Lady Friend column, which talked about matters that would interest women. The market for magazines increased as literacy and public education increased in America. As faster printing technologies were developed and improvements in delivery service increased as well, there was more of a market for magazines. This is really why American magazines were very slow to begin. We had problems being able to deliver magazines coast to coast. It was much more expensive to do so through the postal service than it was for a newspaper, which was lighter and cost less to ship. And then it took a really long time to print magazines before the advent of some of the better press systems. And so by 1850, there were nearly 600 magazines that were published regularly thanks to this new interest based on literacy, public education, and developments in technology. Some of the most popular at the time were Graham's Magazine, which was very influential and entertaining. Knickerbocker was kind of a forerunner of the New Yorker and Harper's, featuring a lot of literary magazines and writing. And Nation was pioneered through the political format. So it was one of the first successful political magazines. And then Youth Companion was one of the most successful magazines for younger readers. Women's magazines began in 1828. The first magazine that was designed exclusively for women was Ladies Magazine. Sarah Joseph Hale was its publisher. And 9 years after its original publication, it merged with Godey's Ladies Book and featured very popular color illustrations. It was also very important for advocacy for women's rights in the mid-1800s. It had a circulation of 40,000, which was the biggest ever in the US at the time. And it really showed that women were a high market for mass media products. Godey's played a central role in educating women who had been denied access to higher education during the 19th century, and it really made a large impact on the women's movement in America. Illustrations began to be used in magazines in the 1850s. Because of the developments in the printing press, magazines had to use drawings, engravings, and woodcuts. It really wasn't until the 1890s that magazines and newspapers could reproduce photos, making it difficult to illustrate magazines. In fact, Godey's was using 150 women to color tint illustrations by hand during their magazine publications. Um, in 1850, Harper's New Monthly magazine used extensive woodcut illustrations and was known for including Civil War battlefield sketches. And images and words really became critical in helping magazine become America's first mass medium. Now, you can see this gentleman here is a battlefield photographer. He was one of the very first photojournalists because he was reporting from Civil War battle scenes and was really known as one of the first photographers or photojournalists, rather, in our country. His name is Matthew Brady. Now, here are some of the illustrations that you can see from the magazines. They were very detailed drawings, but again, they were very difficult to mass produce. Here are some from Godey's, so you can see the stylish fashion of the time. Now, modern magazines really began developing after the Postal Act of 1879, which lowered postage rates for magazines. This put magazines on equal footing with newspapers for the first time. Magazines were especially expensive to send out through the Postal Service because they weighed so much. They were so heavy that you would really have to pay a much higher fee to get a magazine subscription. So this cut cost, and then additional costs were cut through conveyor systems, assembly lines, and better press technology. And so around the early 1900s, prices were cut dramatically from 35 cents to 15 cents and then down all the way to 10 cents. This allowed the working class to begin buying magazines and really made it possible for magazines to be a mass medium. In 1905, there were 25 national magazines that published coast to coast, and it really created this idea that Americans were national citizens instead of just regional, because finally there was a communication that could be shared across the nation. We also saw a large growth in magazines during this time because there were more drugstores, dime stores, supermarkets, and department stores that were selling magazines. Now, the magazines typically sold for less than they cost to make, making them not a great financial investment, because if you sell a magazine for 12 cents, but it costs 40 cents to make it, you're going to be losing money on it. So this is why ad space became particularly important. In the mid 1800s, Harper's Magazine only had 7 pages of ads, but by 1900, they had to have 90 pages of ads to make up for the production cost of the magazine. Ads were really meant to capture consumers' attention, and it helped build a national marketplace for the first time, really, because you were communicating to all of the nation instead of just regionally. Ladies' Home Journal in 1883 was one of the first to recognize that female consumers were going to be a very profitable market. And so by the early 1890s, they had 500,000 in circulation, which was the highest in the country. And in 1903, Ladies' Home Journal became the first magazine to reach 1 million in circulation. Now, around this time in the early 1900s, there was a movement in the magazine industry towards social reform and what was called muckraking. Yellow journalism is when a journalist would use social reform on behalf of the public good. So all of their writing was meant to expose wrongs that were happening in society. some of the topics that were discussed through yellow journalism were unregulated patent medicines, so people trying to sell medicine and claiming that they did something when they really didn't. Poor living and working conditions for various lower class people, and unsanitary practices in the food industry. A lot of the journalists who were writing for magazines during this time were those who didn't like the inverted pyramid style of writing. They wanted more narrative type styles, and so they moved to magazines in order to be able to do more in-depth pieces that allowed for a little more creativity. One of those was Ida Tarbell, who wrote for McClure magazine, and she produced a series of investigative journalism called The History of Standard Oil Company. Standard Oil Company was owned by John D. Rockefeller, who was one of the business giants in America in the 1900s. And he had started an oil monopoly. And so Ida Tarbell produced a series that took up 19 articles on how Rockefeller's business practices were actually hurting the American economy by creating this unfair monopoly. And so this is just one example of yellow journalism. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt dubbed investigative reporters muckrakers, which is where we get the term muckraking journalist. But while President Roosevelt really meant this as a derogatory term, a lot of journalists saw this as a badge of honor because investigative journalists were responsible for paving the way for very important changes in social reform, such as the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, antitrust laws, fair and progressive income taxes, and direct election of U.S. senators. So journalists were responsible for a lot of great changes that happened within our country during this time. Now, the era of muckraking really ended in 1910 when the U.S. entered World War I, because instead of having a watchdog role, the field of journalism really needed to unite the nation, which was under war. Now, in 1897, Cyrus Curtis bought the Saturday Evening Post and made it the first popular general interest magazine. They produced popular fiction and romanticized American values. Think about Norman Rockwell, if you're familiar with his paintings. He actually produced 322 covers for the Saturday Evening Post. His images really defined a nation during this time. In the 1920s, the Saturday Evening Post became the first magazine to hit 2 million in circulation. And because of kind of their idealistic romanticizing of American values and images, Saturday Evening Post and general interest magazines were really the most prominent from World War I until the mid to late 1950s. One of the key aspects for their success was photojournalism, using pictures to document daily life. It really gave magazines an advantage over the most popular medium during this time, which was radio, because instead of just having to imagine the image, the reader could actually see what was going on. So photojournalism is an important part of magazine culture. Here are some of Norman Rockwell's very well-known covers. I'm smiling just looking at some of these because they just bring back happy memories of an idealistic America. Now we know that this is not what America looked like all the time. In fact, you'll notice that there's not a single person of color in any of these photos. It shaped what American values were meant to be at that time for a large population. Now, photojournalism was extremely important for magazines as well. You can see the migrant mother picture, which was very well known, or the kissing sailor, which showed the end of the war. And so these are moments in our history that were captured through photojournalism that still live on today. And we can see that photojournalism continues to remain an important aspect of journalism as a whole, but the magazine industry as well. Now, general interest magazines, again, were most popular from World War I to the 1950s, but Reader's Digest was created in 1922. It condensed articles and it made it so that the reading was much shorter. In its early years, it didn't have any advertisements, and it was very inexpensive to produce. It was low cost, and it even fit in your pocket when it was first created. So during the Great Depression, it was an extremely popular publication with over 1 million in circulation. And by 1945, it was the nation's most popular magazine. And by the mid 80s, it was the most popular in the world. Right now, it has a readership of about 20 million, 10 to 12 million abroad. But now today there's only a readership of about 3 million. So the 20 million figure was back in the mid 80s. So it's declined very much in readership since then. Time magazine is also a general interest magazine known for its interpretive journalism and narrative structure. Really dealt with a lot of important issues throughout our history. Life magazine, which was created in 1936, really spoke to the way that Americans were interested in visual communication with images. They wrote in the style of radio journalism, and it really made advertising and fashion photography very popular. During its heyday, it had 17 million in readership, and something pretty cool to check out if you love photography. Google actually has a life photo archive that you can look through from 1860s to the 1970s. And they have some very amazing images that really capture American life. Now, the popularity of a TV guide actually happened in the 1950s, and it began to signal the decline in general interest magazines. TV Guide was created in 1953. Its first issue sold 1.5 million copies. And by 1962, it was the first weekly to reach 8 million in circulation. By the late 80s, Murdoch was using it to promote his then new Fox network. And by 2005, it really became an entertainment magazine focused solely on television and entertainment industry overall. In 2008, the company was headed for a very large economic decline, and they actually sold it to a venture capitalist for $1. That's not a typo. One single dollar it was sold for. But by 2009, that capitalist had Lionsgate purchase TV Guide Network and TVGuide.com for $255 million. That's a pretty good investment, if you ask me. Now, the reason that TV Guide being so popular is important in the overall history of magazine really deals with three key issues going on at the time. First, the rise in specialization. TV Guide spoke to an entertainment interest. Second, it spoke to the growing sales at checkout lines. So people would buy TV Guides as they were grocery shopping or at a drugstore, things like that. And that became a fast revenue producer for the magazine industry. And then it also showed that magazines were beginning to suffer at the hands of television. So instead of fighting your enemy, use them to your advantage, as TV Guide did. Now, a lot of magazines began to fold during the late 60s and early 70s because they were selling at less than production cost, and ad revenue began to shift more heavily to TV. Postal rates also increased dramatically during the 70s, which really meant that the typical print publication of magazines just wasn't popular. Now, the survivors of the Great Decline in the 60s and 70s of the magazine industry were women's magazines. Women's magazines, particularly those focused on fashion and glamour, continued to be very popular. People was one of the most successful launches in decades within the magazine industry. It began in 1974 and really featured celebrity profiles and human interest stories. The articles were much shorter than the typical magazine story. In fact, they were about one third shorter than their typical competitor, and they were very image heavy. They also focused on supermarket sales, just like TV Guide did. And today it is one of the first in terms of ad revenue and circulation sales, where they garner $1.5 billion. Now, with the advent of digital, magazines really saw a shift and a refocus of the industry, but not nearly as much as the news and newspaper industry has. The internet offers magazines unlimited space. It also allows for more of an audiovisual experience where magazines are beginning to increasingly use social media and video aspects within their reporting. And there's no high paper or mailing costs. So that's really been the biggest help for them. Now, web zines are those that appear exclusively online. There are also those that offer tablet and magazine apps, such as Entertainment Weekly, Cosmo, Nat Geo, Time, GQ, and Vanity Fair. By 2010, there were 98 iPad apps for magazine, but by 2012, there were over 2,000. So we've seen significant growth in recent years in magazine apps. And because print and digital readership are reported together, it's sometimes hard to piece out who's reading print and who's reading digital. Overall readership for the industry is at about 224 million as of 2018. But 75% of magazine readers say that the apps complement print, while 25% say that the apps have replaced their print magazine. So people still want to read a traditional print publication, but they like that they can also get it digitally.